Believe in the process. It is possible to recover, but don't change the original recipe. And give up on yourself as your own solution, because if you look in the rearview mirror, you have failed over time. You may have had periods of short recovery, but you've not had sustainable recovery.
Food Addiction is a podcast which explores the disease of food addiction and presents the solution. We interview professionals and counselors who specialize in the disease of food addiction, and we interview individuals who have successfully recovered from food addiction and discuss how they did it. Esther Helga Gudmundsdottir was motivated to change careers after she recovered from food addiction by opening a food addiction treatment center and the INFACT School, the world's first and only sugar and food addiction counseling training, which offers a recognized certification. Check out the website for more information on obtaining this certification, as well as proven recovery programs at infactschool.com. Listen to these episodes as we discuss the problem and the solution around food addiction. I'm Susan Branscombe. I am a recovered food addict and the host of this podcast, Food Addiction, the Problem and the Solution. My guest today is Dr. Guttorm Toverud. Welcome, Dr. Toverud.
Thank you so very much. I'm honored and humbled to be a guest.
Yeah, this is going to be great. I'm really looking forward to this. So I'm going to introduce you with your bio and that we've put together based on the various sources, talk about your work, and dive into some questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, good. Dr. Toverud has a Ph.D. in counselor education from UNC, which is University of North Carolina at Greensboro, North Carolina. He has a master's degree in agency counseling from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina. He is currently a consultant in his own company, GT Consulting. The company provides substance abuse and dependence consulting services within treatment, clinical supervision, program development, assessment and diagnosis, and educational programs. He spent his career in education and conducting workshops regarding substance abuse and dependence. Dr. Toverud has conducted workshops for 30 years in both Norway and Sweden, and more than 10,000 people now have participated. He is a specialist in using the 12-step model for treating substance and behavioral addictions, allowing individuals to learn how to live life on life's terms. He teaches at Esther Helga Gudmundsdottir's INFACT School. This podcast is an INFACT School podcast. The course he teaches is entitled Professionals Applying the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. His portion of this training is 50 hours for the INFACT School. And of course, classes start this September 2023. The website is infactschool.com to learn more about classes and obtaining a certification in the treatment of food addiction as a counselor. So in my research, Dr. Toverud, to prepare for this podcast, I've listened to a lot of hours of your lectures. Not 50 hours, but a lot of hours of your lectures. And they're very good. I've benefited from the detailed and informative instruction.
Thank you.
Yeah. For those listening that may not know the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous was written in 1939 and has instructions around using a 12-step program for recovery from addiction. The 12-step model from the Big Book, which is the instructions, the format, the program, has been used in many substance abuse and behavioral addiction recovery programs, including, of course, alcohol addiction and food addiction recovery programs. It is one of the 100 most published nonfiction books in the world, having surpassed 50 million copies. The course that Dr. Toverud conducts centers on the context steps, the action steps, and the fourth dimension of existence, demonstrating how professional counselors can increase their understanding of the 12-step program and the use of 12-step fellowships as a resource. The course format is based on using the Big Book as a foundation for treatment. Did I get that right?
You did. That was an amazing summary.
Well, I kind of worked on it. I took from several different sources, but I think I captured what you do and your work. So start by talking about the work you have done and the work you do. Talk about that. We'd love to hear it.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I'm honored to be a guest on Esther Helga's podcast program. I'd like to start off by coming with a disclaimer. I do not speak on behalf of Alcoholics Anonymous, and no one does. And that's one of the reasons that they actually wrote the book and published the book in 1939 was that they didn't want the word of mouth to represent what they wrote, and then subsequently it is conference approved literature, and both the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and most other 12-step fellowships do not want personal representatives. So my focus is that we are professionals applying,
Yes.
using what is written, and therefore we're in many respects bound to what is written. And in the introduction and the prefaces of the book, it states that in this fourth edition, that part of the book which explains the 12-step recovery program is more or less unchanged from 1939.
Yes.
And so all of us that are 12-step counselors, everything was decided in 1939 and what we are to convey in a clinical setting and from a therapeutic perspective. We have nothing to do with the fellowships, and therefore it's an application. We've chosen as professionals to use this book in our clinical work with clients. So again, I do not represent AA or any other 12-step program. This is a clinical application.
I understand that, and I understand the reason for saying that, and but it is a textbook, So, and you use this textbook to train professionals on how to counsel their clients. So, talk about that work that you've done all these years. Is it 35 years you've done it?
So for 35 years, I have been using this book. I sort of say that I've been hiding out in Scandinavia, trying to fine tune how to actually use what is written in the textbook, not only in a clinical setting, but also as a profession. And then after I met Esther, she asked me if I would be willing to expand into an international audience. And initially I was hesitant, but you can't say no to Esther. So
No.
I
Haven't yet.
I agreed to do that, and it has actually opened up a whole new world for me. And I realize that other people besides Norwegians and Swedes can actually benefit from the work that I have done. And since I do have a doctorate degree in counselor education, I've been able to unlock some of these codes that are in the book in terms of using it as our manual.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting how we can then start at the beginning of the book, and that's what I do in the lecture series. And then I demonstrate. We read this out loud, and then we say this. And then I say, but now you can't say this because it's coming up later, but you need to know now that in 3 pages, they're going to come back to this particular point. So you need to highlight that now. And so make sure that is in place before you go on. So it really is a detailed approach, almost reading every single word, which is why it takes me about 50 hours. And then I complement those the lectures with visual slides,
Yes. Yeah.
and they then help make it become a more pedagogically appropriate understanding. So we have the text on one side, we have the slides on the other side, and then we have the lectures accompanying that.
Yeah, I watched, these were on Vimeo, so I not only listened to you, but I watched the slides as well. Some of our listeners might not be familiar with the big book. Some of our listeners perhaps have been long term recovered addicts, perhaps food addicts. And I want to make sure our episode is valuable to both. So the questions I've prepared, I think, will work for listeners of all kinds. And we only have an hour here, so we don't have 50 hours. So we're going to do the best we can to bring up some high points, and then if anybody wants more information, they can go to Esther's website. But as I mentioned earlier, I've listened to the lectures. They felt a bit like a college course to me, kind of an academic approach. Let's make the case for professionals to use the big book in their practice with clients. Very intellectual, very logical, rational. It's like, okay, this all makes sense to me. It felt like a kind of a college class. So at the INFACT School, you're teaching counselors how to use it to counsel their clients. Talk about this.
This is true. You're very insightful. Uh, One of my claims is one size fits all. And so there has to be a reason that these other 12-step fellowships have come subsequently to the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous and then the publication of the big book. And the different fellowships all have these same 12 steps. The only difference is the first step, which is the problem identification. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, they'll refer to alcohol, and then in Gamblers Anonymous, they will refer to gambling, but they're all wanting to use the same 12 steps. So then I build on the understanding that I have gained that the big book has the original recipe. And
Mm-hmm.
since they didn't want anybody to change that, then I use the original recipe regardless of what substance or behavior they are addicted to. And I'm able to make that claim because it also states in the Book of Alcoholics Anonymous that alcohol is but a symptom.
Yes.
So that's my argument for one size fits all. And then,
Mm-hmm.
as professional counselors, we can then tailor our lecture to the different addictions,
Mm-hmm.
but then use the original text
Yes.
to convey a specific point, and then we can extrapolate on that. And yes, it is a very intellectual presentation, but in the introduction to the big book, they do claim it to be a textbook.
Mm.
And textbooks
Mm-hmm.
are written by authors. They claim 101 or 102 authors. And then they're supposed to, in a textbook, then present some information to the reader. And here they're talking about exactly what those first 101 and 102 did.
Mm-hmm. So a question for you: how best do you think the big book can be used by, number one, counselors, and then number two, people perhaps struggling with addiction?
Well, for counselors, this is where we then get our mandate. So
Mm.
as you saw in the lecture series, I presented as a standalone theoretical model. It has a problem statement. It has a solution statement. It tells you what to decide. It tells you what to do. It uses 63 pages to sell the doing the work. So I oftentimes refer to it as a brochure
Mhm.
about selling the end result. And so counselors, I think, by using the textbook as it is written, can then sell for the clients to actually do the work. And so nobody is trying to reinvent the wheel. And then as patients, they're only supposed to be duplicating what the authors of the big book wrote. And that's sort of where we get our mandate, because all the client is supposed to do is duplicate what those who wrote the book said that they did.
Right.
And
Yeah.
therefore, we don't need new and improved, since they said we don't want any new and improved. So what we're reading today in the fourth edition, that part that explains what to do and why, is from the 1930s.
Yes.
So that means all the metaphors are from the 30s. That means all the pictures with words are from the 30s. And that means all the references are from the 30s. And therefore, a lot of counselors can feel like it's outdated. But once they've cracked the code that we really don't have a right to change it and then still call it 12-step, then they're able to read out loud what is written and then make appropriate comparisons to today.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is an incredible manual for addiction. There is a lot of terminology and vocabulary that was used that would be from the 30s. It's often felt to be gender biased in favor of men are often referenced versus people or women. Women, of course, can be addicted to substances or behaviors, gambling, for example. So, yeah, but you have to, I think in recovery, and as counselors, you have to look beyond that. And like you say,
Well, it's not just looking beyond it. It's if you want to use this book in
right.
treatment and it says that we don't want any changes to it,
Hmm.
then we have to accept that that those are some of the limitations. But once you've cracked the code, then those aren't limitations anymore, because
Right. Yeah.
it's just duplicating what they did, and whether they did
Hmm.
what they did in the action steps was because they were a man or a woman, it becomes secondary. And
Hmm.
so we can help our clients to diffuse that frustration. And if you want to get frustrated, there's plenty to get irritated about, and
Yeah.
people do.
And the question, I think the point is, at least from my experience and what I've seen, is that if you don't resist what's being said, you're more inclined to use it for your your recovery.
Well, that's true, and I have read some of what the critics write. Obviously, I haven't read everything. But oftentimes, when I read what the critics write, they reference the 12 steps hanging on the wall,
Mm,
and they don't reference what is written in the book. So, for example, step 2, there are 3 chapters
yeah.
in the book that cover the content of the wording of step 2. So
Hmm.
when I work with counselors, I say never put up step 2, never let the client see the wording in step 2 until after you've read 3 chapters, because then all those words make sense,
Yeah.
because it's put into a context. So when I read what the critics write, it becomes to me very obvious that they have not uh, studied those pages in the big book. They may have
Mm,
glanced at it, but most of the critics just read what's written on the wall of those 12 steps. And maybe that's a something that we could address very early in treatment. I know a lot of treatment centers have the steps hanging on the wall, and so the clients
hmm.
read that and already are becoming scared and frustrated and critical prior to reading the book. But if you
Yeah.
read the book, then a lot of those frustrations disappear.
Sure. Let me ask you this question. Do you believe that this is a food addiction podcast? Do you believe that recovery from food addiction is possible without using a 12-step program?
Without using, well,
Right.
there's always going to be spontaneous recovery from any addiction. The problem is we can't duplicate spontaneous recovery. And so it needs to be, that's why it's this how to use the big book, professionals applying it. There are other avenues that people can pursue. My belief is that if we use what is written in the book in the manner in which I try to explain it, and in the pod or the lecture series that you heard, that we're going to get greater results. We haven't done any research on what is actually being conveyed. People call themselves a 12-step treatment program, but we don't know what that means. And oftentimes, as you and I had talked about prior to this, I have this issue about what I call two-hatters. So those are people in recovery that also work professionally, and they tend to want to convey what they did. And that's honorable and admirable, but that's not what we should be doing as counselors. As counselors, we should be getting the clients to duplicate what the first 101 and 102 did. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether you're in personal recovery. And I find that they focus more on themselves as the messenger than on the message. And that's sort of one of my big pet peeves. And a lot of people criticize me for that and saying, well, I should be able to share my own story. And I said, yeah, but then the next counselor that comes in later that day or the following day, we can't say, well, we're on page 22, because then that counselor will know exactly what has been said, what's going to be said now, and what's coming. But if you use your own story, it may not be as detailed and specific, and therefore we sort of go against why they wrote the book. They didn't want anybody to represent them. And so when counselors do that, the two-hatters, they tend to go away. So I think we need to do more research on who is saying what.
Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah, and if you stick to the big book and the instructions and so forth and not self-reference in terms of personal recovery, I think that's what you're saying. You do counseling with GT Consulting. How do you use the big book in your counseling? How do you use the 12-step approach?
Well, then I will, depending on the group, I had one this afternoon, and then we would read where we were from yesterday, and then we would read along today, and then we would have process groups with it. So we would take an example of from the big book, from the first chapter called Bill's Story, where he's explaining some of the tactics he did to convey to his wife that he was going to stop drinking, and he. It says that he had actually written down promises, and then we know from some of the AA history that he wrote those promises in a Bible. And so then we would talk about the desperation that a person would have, the need to write in a Bible, and then you don't have to believe in the Bible, but the idea that a man goes and gets a Bible to write to his wife that he's finished drinking is quite powerful. And then we'll ask, well, what have you done to convey to those around you? And so we take the impetus from the big book, the words, the sentences, and then we ask clients to then reference what they have done.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot we could cover here, but I do want to bring up a couple of points from the big book that the big book addresses, and have you talk about them. In chapter 2 of the big book, the 4th edition, page 25, in a chapter called There is a Solution, it says, "We have found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into a 4th dimension of existence, of which we had not even dreamed." And it further goes on later to say, "The great fact is just this, and nothing less, that we have had deep and effective spiritual experiences which have revolutionized our whole attitude toward life, toward our fellows, and toward God's universe." So How would you describe the fourth dimension to those who may not understand it?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's always hard to sort of cherry pick sentences from this book. And normally, I would say that we can't answer that until we've started at the beginning, and then we get
Yes,
to that point.
right.
And I know that that would not be helpful in this podcast to say that. But in the first chapter, they reference the fourth dimension of life as a metaphor for the living in the solution, and so they use that as a type of marketing tool. And
Mm,
then they reference that several times. And so, again, clinically, when I use the book and the counselors that I have trained, then that would be like a common thread throughout, because they keep referring back to this fourth dimension, and then they keep adding to it. So that's why I call it a brochure. So they spend 63 pages marketing then this fourth dimension. And one of those aspects is that one would not have dreamt of this. And so it's used to be able to give an indication of what the client can expect based on what those who wrote the book actually got.
yes,
And so
right.
that's the idea of the fourth dimension. I actually use that as a quality control question when people say that they know the 12-step program, and then I'll use that. What is then the fourth dimension? And 9 times out of 10, they look at me with amazement. What are you referring to?
Hmm.
And then I know that they are not using the big book because it does refer to it. Now,
Yes.
the rocketing that you brought up is a very interesting point, because they had to add an appendix to the big book uh, to 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 alter how one gets into the fourth dimension. And there are 2 ways into the fourth dimension. One is they call it through a rocket or a catapult, and the other way is based on the psychologist William James, who did some research. He was the father of American psychology, the first professor at Harvard, and he said that most people have these spiritual experiences as a result of doing something. So obviously, we can't have a treatment program based on a rocket or a catapult, but we can have a treatment program based on doing something. So our mandate actually comes from William James. And that's another question I ask people. How does William James fit into this? And if they don't know that, then I know that they're not using the big book, and then they're coming up with their own understanding, and we're not
Mm.
supposed to come with our own understanding.
Yeah, the other section in the big book, which is often used in recovery programs, the section called the doctor's opinion. Dr. Silkworth renders an opinion, writes a letter to the founders, and talk about the doctor's opinion and why do you think it is important, an important section. I assume you think it's an important section of the big book for recovery from addiction. I mean, we may end the interview here if you don't, but I assume you think it's a pretty important thing. So tell the listeners about the doctor's opinion, the
Well,
significance of it.
it is, and thank you for bringing that up, Susan, because again, there are oftentimes misunderstandings uh, to this physician, William Silkworth. He had a theory prior to meeting one of the founders of AA, Bill W.
Hmm.
That there was a two-pronged problem. There was something physical that prevented an alcoholic from drinking controlled consistently over time, and that there was a mental component that allowed them to start again, even after they have written in the Bible that they were not going to ever
Not
drink
going to do it. Right.
again. And this is the basis for the understanding of the addiction. And what I find interesting is, although I am not a medical person, my PhD is in counselor education. I'm not an MD, but from what I have gathered, the literature today is using different words, but they're explaining the same thing. We know that there is a physical component to addiction today, and we know that there is a mental component to addiction today. Unfortunately, Silkworth doesn't get the credit he deserves. But those of us who have an understanding of both schools realize that he was onto something, and this was to dismay this notion of being bad.
Mm.
And it was very how you're sick, you're not a bad person.
Right.
And what's interesting is he wrote back in the big book that there is no solution for the physical component, and that is equally true today, or we'd all be out of a job. So the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps, works on that mental compulsion to start again, the mental obsession. And therefore, we can apply it, the mental obsession, to start again with alcohol, with food,
Food,
with sex, with gambling, with
drugs.
any
Hmm.
one of
Hmm.
the behavioral addictions or substance addictions. And then we're back to the one size fits all,
Right.
because it's not starting again. And I know that it's very difficult for those that have a food addiction. And Esther has been very helpful in being able to explain that part. But we can set up this, what is called abstinence, also in food addiction.
Hmm.
So once we've cracked that code, it's going to be abstinence from what they are addicted to within that context.
Right. Yeah. We continue to have to eat, but I think the abstinence with food addiction, of course, is usually sugar, often flour, trigger foods, volume eating, and then you get into anorexia and bulimia. It can be, different ways to use food. But I think the doctor's opinion for me, not to interpret, but I think for many people that have been through recovery, it is saying that it's not our fault that when we ingest something like alcohol, like sugar, our bodies don't respond like other people. We're not normal in that way. We cannot have controlled drinking. We cannot have controlled eating around sugar and food, certain foods. And then it sets up this phenomenon of craving. And so we want more. And then the mental obsession begins. Like, I want cookies. I want candy. That's what the doctor's opinion means to me anyway. That it's not my fault, and that I'm not a bad person because of this. Um, and that's why it's critical to the start of this.
It is critical because there is a lot of guilt and shame
Yes.
that I'm a bad person, a weak-willed person, and then not the understanding that you're actually a sick person.
Hmm.
But we still have to find a way to live life on life's terms so that the mental obsession does not become a reality. And that's what the action steps that you referenced initially actually do. They are a set of activities that are able to uh, 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 relieve the mental obsession to start again. And
Right.
when you read the big book, they're always talking about starting again, not initial use, but starting again. So they reference the first drink, and then with food addicts, we'll reference the first trigger food, or the
Hmm.
gambling addict. She's going to put down $50. And so it's this starting again. And
Yeah.
therefore, the whole 12-step program is exclusively designed on not starting again.
Yeah.
And therefore, we can extrapolate that and use the original recipe regardless of which addiction we're talking about.
Right. Well, in the time we have remaining on the podcast, I'd like to take some time to talk about the steps. the 12 steps within the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, starting on page 58, how it works, chapter 5, and address them with you.
I can just say that in steps 1, 2, and 3, those are what I call the context steps. So
Okay.
step 1 tells you where you are. There's no question mark. They tell you where
Okay.
they were, the first 100 and 102. Step 2 tells you where they went, where they ended up. And then step 3 is where they said that they made the decision to go from living in the problem to living in the solution. But they're still in the problem when they take that decision. And I oftentimes use a travel a metaphor. You're at home and you decide you want to go to another place. I always use Cape Verde because I met somebody from there that says you need to go there, and I've never been there, but I want to go.
Yeah.
And then they describe it. So that's what I'm saying. They use 63 pages in the book to describe the solution, where you're going to want to go. And that's when they try to use that metaphor of the fourth dimension. They make it exciting. They tell you what they've gotten in hopes that you will then make the decision. But you're still at home. You have the tickets. You know where you are. You know where you're going to go. But then you have to decide and then do it.
Right.
And then it's steps 4 through 9 that move you from living in the problem to living in the solution. So it's
let's stick with if we can stick with steps 1, 2, and 3, because and then we're going to go to 4 and 5. 4 and 5. I'm not going to read them, but so the listener can understand if he or she doesn't, that when you come into the 12-step program as a way to deal with your addiction, that addicts have had negative consequences from our addiction. Food addiction recovery, for example, high blood pressure, diabetes, you weigh 250 pounds, alcohol, drugs, financial problems, family problems, work, spiritual problems, legal. So there's some reason that somebody's coming into this. So step 1 is and then step 2, it's like, I give up. I couldn't do it. So talk about steps 1, 2, and 3 in that regard.
Well, the consequences that you just referenced are a result of the addiction.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of not being able to control how much over a certain period of time consistently results in those consequences. And it's quite ironic because nobody comes to treatment because of the addiction. They come because of the consequences.
Yes.
And so that's sort of the way to come in to addiction, is through the consequences. Then we share with them this notion of the problem that causes those consequences, because a lot of people want solutions to the consequences, but then they won't get a solution to the addiction. And that's why we see people change addictions. And that's why we need to keep the focus on then this mental obsession to start anew or find something else that causes that same relief that that using does. So we start with the problem statement, and then we go on to that there is then a solution to this problem, and that's when they try to explain that this is solvable, because most of our clients have oftentimes reached the point where they've not been able to solve it, and they really don't think that it is possible to do that. And therefore, this self-identifying with what is written in the book makes it possible for them to say, well, listen, if he could do it and she could do it, then maybe I can do it.
Right.
And this is the marketing that I talk about in 63 pages. Before they do it. And then they say, but you know what? We can't do anything about controlling how much. We're just going to control not starting again. So that's what the steps then are about, is doing that. And then the last steps, the 10, 11, and 12, are then what we call the growth steps, the fourth dimension, which is then a relapse prevention component. So it's to prevent relapsing back into the problem. And that's very fascinating that 3 of the 12 steps are relapse prevention steps. And unfortunately, we often see clients go through a 12-step program not reaching the fourth dimension, and then someone else is going to take over and they use a different model. And
Hmm.
therefore, I think some of the negative research results on the efficacy of the program is partially our problem as professionals, not using the same model continuously.
Hmm.
And so we have this different models coming in and out
Yeah.
is not helpful. It's one
Right.
model from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. I mean, steps to go back to steps 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to go to the work. Let's clean things up and see what the problem is in 4 through
Yeah.
9. Okay. Which I've personally
4 through
done.
9 moves you from living in the problem
To
to the
living in the
solution.
solution, right. So steps 1, 2, and 3, some people don't seek recovery because they feel as though they believe that you have to believe in God. You have to have some higher power. You have to do that in order to recover. And the founders have a chapter called We Agnostics. So it's not necessary to believe in the traditional God, or if there is one, for any religion, right? I would speak to that.
It's a very good question, and those are some common concerns, and also part of the criticism that is used against this model. Again, we're separate from the fellowship. This is a professional application of what's written in there, but we also
Hmm.
have to be respective of the history. These 12 steps have come from the Oxford group movement, which was the largest religious movement in the previous century, and that's where they originated. But uh, uh, they were able to modify some of the understanding of a God, not necessarily having to be the Christian God, which was the premise for the Oxford groups,
Right.
and it became a God of your understanding. And the whole notion here is that as a result of doing these steps, you will gain an understanding.
Hmm.
And most people want to have the understanding prior to doing the work, yet it's the work in steps 4 through 9 that then allow you the understanding. So that's why they try to market this again. I've never been to Cape Verde. Nobody would ever ask me to describe what it's like to be in Cape Verde. But everybody wants to have an understanding of what it's like to be in the fourth dimension prior to going there, but it's after you get there. And these are the clinical codes that we have to crack with our patients, because they do want to have the understanding prior to doing the work, rather than the work providing then the understanding.
Hmm.
So this the whole notion of a Christian God was dispelled prior to the book being written, and that was actually what made it palatable
Yeah.
for one of the co-founders, Bill W., because he didn't like the Oxford group's understanding,
Hmm.
and that was what was made it possible for him to do the work,
Yeah.
was that it wasn't a Christian, but it is still a non-human solution. So it's
Yes. So whatever that higher power is, or God, yeah.
but it isn't anything religious, and those are things we have to work on.
Right. So spend a few minutes talking about the work, get to work steps, and the solution steps 4 through 9. And there's a lot there. So we don't have a lot of time to address them, but you involve another person, you tell another person fears, resentments, and then character defects, and then you start saying you're sorry. And if I had to, it's like a summarizing, but talk about steps 4 through 9.
Another way of looking at it is this mental obsession comes as a result of your emotions reaching a boiling point, and either you want to celebrate or you want to console by starting again. And you've
Yeah.
learned how to do that. So the steps 4 through 9 is figuring out what is in your emotional barometer, how it got in there. 3 of those steps are to empty what's in there, and 2 of those steps is to alter what comes in. So that's a much easier way to explain it so that people don't get caught up, because once you've read all the pages prior to those instructions, it makes sense because you've read the 63 pages of the brochure.
Yeah.
But by jumping straight to the steps themselves, it causes this misunderstanding, and that's again why I've focused on how we can, as professionals, actually use what is written there in this clinical manner to help our clients be willing to do the work without getting caught up in the wording, because it's the wording in the steps that has become very frustrating and scary.
Yeah.
But if it's interesting. Many times I have explained to other professionals what I do, and I never mention AA. I never mention the steps. I never mention a higher power. I just say, this is what we do with the emotional, and they just look at me and they're in amazement. And it's, I even have a book that says how to do it. And I said, this is one of the 100 most published books in the history. And they said, well, what's the name of that book? Well, then I'm dead in the water. When I tell them the name of the book, then all these myths and misconceptions and criticisms come up. And I do have to say that I think we could do a much better job in our profession if we focused on just using the big book and not these, not your own story.
Yeah, your own
do
story.
that in the fellowship.
Yeah, do that in the fellowship. Yeah. No, I get it. But anybody listening that is like, okay, what is food addiction? My problem with eating cookies and candy to the point where I weigh 300 pounds have to do with any of this,
Exactly.
And so what I guess what I would like to say to them and is, when I got into recovery for alcohol and food, I just said, help me stop drinking. I don't know what you people are talking about, but help me stop drinking, help me stop eating.
Right.
And
that's
this worked.
Desperation.
It's
and
the
they
desperation, the
and
negative
we meet
consequences.
them where we are.
We come in and then it's like, okay, here's what we've done. All these people that I'm seeing have done this, and they have. So what have you done to do this? And, part of it is subordinating an ego so that you say, okay, I give up. I've lost my battle with this substance or with this behavior in a fair fight, right? So we get to work, and so that's the 4 through 9, the action steps, and it's all in the big book, of course. But talk about, as we wrap up at the end here, you were beginning to talk about steps 10 through 12, very important steps. We continue to take inventory and make sure that we're not scared, we're not resentful at people, we're not being selfish. Prayer and meditation, and then service. I mean, talk about the last steps of the 12-step program.
Again, you're referencing the steps.
Yes, I am.
and again, that's sort of where I take issue, and it's good because it allows me to make my point.
Yeah.
If we think of it as there's 3 dimensions of a person's life that has been broken, and then we're able to mend those 3 dimensions through the first 9 steps. And then in the 4th dimension, we're going to put a cast around those 3 broken dimensions that have been set in place so that now they can grow together. And I use broken bones as a metaphor. So you break your arm, you go to the doctor, she's going to x-ray it, and then she's going to set the bones before she puts on the cast. Well, that's what
Right.
we do in steps 4 through 9. It's taking the x-ray and putting these dimensions of a person's life back in place, and then we put on a cast. And the cast is going to remain on these 3 dimensions for the rest of the person's life in order for them to grow in being able to live life on life's terms. And it's a very a beautiful thing to offer. And I wish that counselors could start their professional work working with clients in the 4th dimension first, then go back and work with clients in living in the problem. But we seem to always to train the counselors to start with the problem, and then they never get to the solution and the 4th dimension. So I have a few ideas on how we can become better at using this model in our professional practice, because once you've cracked those codes, Susan, it's absolutely amazing. And I know there are a lot of people out there that have gained recovery, durable recovery, and good recovery as a result of these steps. And
millions
and we can do a better job.
People. We could, yes, I'm sure of that. I believe you. Last question today. Last question for you as we wrap up. What would you say to the food addict out there? Someone who might be using food in unhealthy ways, not knowing how to stop when he or she starts, want to be free. How does that person become free? What would you say?
Well, you have to seek help. Very few people can achieve spontaneous recovery, and thankfully, it's becoming more acceptable and more approachable that one has different addictions. Seek help, and then let the helpers tell you what to do. And if they then use the big book, then it's going to be very easy for them to tell you what to do. Believe in the process. It is possible to recover, but don't change the original recipe.
Right.
And give up on yourself as your own solution, because if you look in the rearview mirror, you have failed over time. You may have had periods of short recovery, but you've not had sustainable recovery. So it is possible. We are there, and that's why I'm so grateful that Esther Helga has this as part of her training for the professionals, because they've gotten better at an understanding of the food addiction, and then they will gain a better understanding of this solution of one size fits all. And we can use this book as professionals.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Toverud. I've enjoyed this. I've become quite inspired by your work and you and everything you do. Thank you for everything you do. And Esther and I appreciate you being a guest on the podcast today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. As you can hear, this is something I'm passionate about, and I really believe that we as professionals can do a much better job in helping those that can't help themselves. So I'm honored to be a part of this profession and being able to share this.
Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Susan.
This is the Food Addiction Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and learned more about this disease. We hope you will rate and write a review on this podcast and share it with others. If you or someone you know is suffering from the disease of food addiction, there is a solution. The various food addiction recovery programs are available and listed on the website, theinfactschool.com. Or if you would like to know more about how to get certified in treating food addiction, the school is accepting applications now for its next training beginning in September 2023. Go to theinfactschool.com. That's INFACT school.com to learn more.